Hey guys, this is Mike Wolf, and welcome to the podcast. Today's guest is Bruce Friedrich, who is the founder and CEO of the Good Food Institute. If you've been in alternative protein, in the future of food, you've probably have heard of the Good Food Institute and of Bruce Friedrich. They publish these really great reports. I'm a former market analyst, and so I dig these deeply researched reports on investment and trends and the key players in the space, and I really enjoy that. But they do lots of other things. They work with governments and investors and really try to just catalyze the alternative protein space across, cultured meat and plant-based and precision fermentation. So they do a lot of great work. And so it's good to have Bruce on the podcast and talk with him about what's going on, where he sees the space going, and what's happening with regulation and when we can eat this stuff more widely, like cultured meat. When will that be available on store shelves? So we talk with Bruce about that and a bunch of other stuff. So it was a good conversation. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. As always, if you want to get more podcasts, you can go to thespoon.tech or just go to your regular podcast bases like iTunes, or is there even iTunes anymore? Apple Music or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. So, all right, that's it. Let's get to my conversation with Bruce. All right, well, I'm excited to be here with Bruce Friedrich of the Good Food Institute. Bruce, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Mike. I'm really delighted to be here, too. Thank you.
Yeah. Last time we connected in person was in Las Vegas for CES, and it's good to reconnect with you again. And I'm pretty familiar with the Good Food Institute. I spent a lot of time on your website consuming all your research, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in just a minute. But for those who aren't familiar with the Good Food Institute, tell us what it is.
So GFI is actually 6 independent nonprofit organizations. We have about 150 total staff, and we're essentially focused on creating a world where alternative proteins are no longer alternatives. So organizationally, we focus on how do we create a world where meat is made from plants and meat is cultivated from cells. The plurality of GFI team members are probably scientists, so building a scientific ecosystem is something that we focus on across the 6 areas where we work. The 6 NGOs with Good Food Institute branding. One is in the U.S., and then we also have GFIs in India, Israel, Brazil, Asia Pacific out of Singapore, and Europe out of both Brussels and London. And we work on science, basically building a scientific ecosystem. We work on policy, and our global battle cry is that governments should be funding open access science into alternative proteins, and governments should be incentivizing private sector R&D as well as private sector manufacturing and infrastructure build out. For the same reason governments are funding drug development or renewable energy or electrification of transport, they should also be funding and incentivizing this. And then our third programmatic area is corporate engagement. And we work with companies from actually even, entrepreneurs who are pre-idea to help them figure out white spaces, all the way up to the world's largest meat companies and the world's largest food companies. And when we're working with meat and food companies, it's focused on making the transition a transition. When GFI started, we talked about disrupting the meat industry. Now we talk about transforming the meat industry and helping the JBSs and the Tysons and the Cargills and the ADMs and the Nestles to see their place, their essential place in accelerating a shift away from industrial animal meat and toward alternative ways of making meat.
That rephrasing and recharacterization towards transforming from disrupting was thoughtful and purposeful, I imagine, as you work with these large incumbents who are, they make billions of dollars every year selling, slaughtered meat. It seems to me like a lot of them are open to the idea of, hey, let's move towards new ways of doing this. A lot of them have embraced plant-based. Some of them invested in cultured meat. How would you kind of characterize the thinking of these large corporates? I know they're not like a monolith, but how would you characterize just generally how it's shifted over the years?
I mean, our pitch to them is, look, we've been making meat the same way for 12,000 years. It is extraordinarily inefficient. So the most efficient animal at turning crops into meat is the chicken. According to the World Resources Institute, it takes 9 calories in the form of soy or wheat or corn or whatever you're turning into feed. It takes 9 calories into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out. So that's literally 800% waste just in the physiology of the chicken. And then you're shipping, so that's 9 times as much land, 9 times as much water, 9 times as many pesticides and herbicides. And then you're shipping all of those crops to the feed mill, and you're operating the feed mill, and then you're shipping the feed to the farm, and you're operating the farm, and then you're shipping the animals to the slaughterhouse, and you're operating the slaughterhouse. Each of those stages of production is incredibly fragile. So we have a very fragile food system with a whole bunch of steps and a lot of inefficiency. So our pitch to the folks who make meat and the folks who make food is essentially don't be Kodak, be Canon. Canon saw digital film coming. Kodak did not see digital film coming. There is a lot of profit to be made from this shift. You are the folks who know how to make meat. You are the folks with the distribution channels. You are the folks with the contracts with the grocery stores and the fast food chains and everything else. You should be on the front lines of this. And that is going really, really well. So all of the world's largest meat companies and all of the world's largest food companies are taking very, very seriously alternative proteins. And the 2 biggest meat companies in the United States are Tyson and Cargill. They both have plant-based lines, and they both have invested in 2 different cultivated meat companies. And then JBS, GFI Brazil, works very closely with JBS. GFI US does too. I'm sorry, with JBS. GFI US does also. And JBS, when they put out their press release about their $100 million investment in cultivated meat, credited GFI as a partner and an advisor there. So far it's going really quite well. And this makes sense. I mean, we oftentimes say people eat meat despite how it's produced, not because of how it's produced. But that's also true for these companies. Their business model is, let's supply protein to as many people as possible, as profitably as possible. And if they can do that without the sort of fragile supply chain, the diffuse supply chain that breaks down so easily, and all of the external costs of their current production method, it's not surprising that they would be enthusiastic about that.
It's definitely markedly different than, I would say, the oil industry and kind of how they are treating some of the more clean alternatives. It seems like the meat companies, at least kind of the big ones that you mentioned, are more open to alternatives than what we've seen with like other industries incumbents.
I think renewable energy is like a complete challenge to and change in their business model. So if you go to a company and say right now, your production process requires 9 times the inputs relative to plant-based meat if you're talking about chicken. And I mean, that same World Resources Institute report, if you're talking about feedlot beef, you're talking about 40 calories into a cow to get 1 calorie out. So if you're asking, an oil company to stop doing fossil fuels, that is a complete restructure of their business plan. But if you're asking, a food company, a meat company, to transition to being a protein company, it's not that feels like it's probably quite a bit easier.
We mentioned earlier the research that you guys produce. I find it a great resource every year. You guys really do publish some great reports. And I think within the last month or 2, you published 3, this kind of the state of plant-based, the state of fermentation, and the state of cultivated. And I would encourage anyone who is interested in the space to go to the GFI website and download those because they're free. I think I was talking real quick about plant-based. I think some people were surprised in the industry about how it kind of flattened in 2021. What is your general feel, the reason for that, particularly in the U.S.? I don't think it was necessarily as flat in other parts of the world, but why do you think plant-based meat essentially didn't grow in 2021?
Yeah, let me just also, thanks for your kind words about those reports. So for people, GFI does do a whole bunch of webinars and produce a lot of sort of think tanky resources. We have a monthly webinar, The Science of Alt Protein for scientists. We have a monthly webinar, The Business of Alt Protein for startups and businesses. We also will do webinars for all of the various think tanky reports that we put out. So as you rightly noted, we did a plant-based state of the industry, fermentation state of the industry, cultivated meat state of the industry, and we also did alternative seafood state of the industry. Plant-based foods over the last 2 years have gone up 45%. So they were stagnant in 2021, but they were up 45% the year before.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of supply chain issues that plagued the conventional meat industry, and some of those also plagued the plant-based foods industry, plant-based meat and other plant-based products. But it's also, when you've gone up 45% in 1 year, it's still 45% over 2 years, which is pretty impressive numbers.
What are you excited about in terms of plant-based? One of the things I think the industry has to be excited about when I'm looking what's next, I think whole cuts are exciting. I'm seeing a lot of kind of like fungi-based kind of whole cuts, mycelium-based. It seems like there may be a kind of another wave of new and interesting products coming that I think could potentially drive growth numbers up.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. GFI's overall organizational thesis is that for the products to break out of niche, they are going to need to taste the same or better, and they're going to need to cost the same or less. So they're going to stay a sort of early adopter niche product and figuring out what the ceiling is until they get to taste the same or better and cost the same or less will be interesting to see. But there is a ton of innovation that is in the pipeline, and I think you're right. We're going to see that both with the whole biomass fermentation, so the microbial proteins, which is the fungi that you're talking about, but also a lot of innovation happening in plant-based as well. So I think they will have an up year, but we're borderline recession, an awful lot of crazy stuff happening in the economy, crazy stuff happening with inflation. It seems like consumer spending is staying high, even as the stock market is tanking. So it's just a very it's just a very odd time to try to predict market dynamics, I think, right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of market uncertainty. There's a lot of inflation, but I think one thing that may be in favor of plant-based meat is the price curve is coming down as production processes get better, and they just figure it out. Whereas animal agriculture prices just continue to go up. So I don't think this was a thing we could have said 2 years ago, where plant-based could become like the value option, right? Do you think more people may put their money towards that if it just becomes more affordable?
Well, it's becoming, I suppose, relatively more affordable because the prices for plant-based are not going up in the same way that the prices for conventional meat are going up. But they're still, they haven't reached price parity.
Right.
The price for beef and chicken and pork would really have to skyrocket to get to price parity. So I think the value proposition is getting better because the value proposition for conventional meat is just so atrociously bad. But it's just the way of making plant-based meat, or cultivated meat for that matter, is so much more efficient. The supply chain is tighter, and the inputs are so much fewer. But GFI released what we refer to as our production volume modeling report, and we looked at what it would require for plant-based meat to capture 6% of the market by 2030. And there's literally not enough coconut oil in the world right now to get to 6% plant-based meat by 2030. And what that means is we need alternatives to coconut oil. We need synthetic coconut oil. I don't think we're going to ramp up coconut oil output. So people will sometimes, ask the question, since plant-based meat is so much more efficient, why doesn't it cost less? And that's because we do need to ramp up production. We do, like right now, you've got constrained resources. So it might be a lot more efficient to produce one thing than something else. But if we've been producing that other thing for decades and the entire infrastructure exists and the supply is there, and you're doing it at the volumes that meat is produced today, the costs will be artificially low relative to something that is just beginning to ramp up. But I do think that, if demand is a little bit flat, that will allow production processes to catch up. That will allow costs to come down in ways that could be good for the long-term viability of this market dynamic, even as companies are doing the innovation that's required to make sure that they satisfy consumers across, not just price, but also taste. So there have been, I think, some really great pieces that have come out recently. There was something in the Financial Times a couple months ago. There was something on Vox recently. And they were talking about consumer perceptions of plant-based meat. Mm-hmm. And the challenge to the plant-based meat industry in both of those articles is we need products that satisfy meat eaters. The value proposition cannot be pay more for a product that you don't like as much. We need the innovation. We need the R&D. And I think that's a pretty important gauntlet to have thrown down.
There seems to be continuing this idea of we need to get to taste parity, but it seems like there's always going to be a little bit of the uncanny valley of meat. Do you think we need to try to replicate meat as close as possible, or we need to get something for a lot of people that just tastes good but it's different?
I think tastes good but different has been the value proposition of sort of meat reduction advocacy for more than 50 years.
Okay.
And what we have determined is that people want to eat meat. So literally, as we're taping this morning, there's a 10-minute segment on National Public Radio where they ate the Impossible Burger and the Beyond Burger. And the host was talking about his absolute love for burgers and how he doesn't like veggie burgers. Mm-hmm. By the end of the segment, he was saying, this is a total game changer. I cannot tell the difference. I look at these products. I wouldn't have been able to tell you they're not beef. I eat these products. I wouldn't have been able to tell you they're not beef.
Right.
I think the old way of advocacy is convince people to buy something that they're less familiar with. I think with alternative proteins, with making meat from plants and cultivating meat from cells, it's just I think this is the one food and ag solution to climate change, and it also solves a bunch of other problems at the same time. But this is the one thing that analogizes to renewable energy and electric vehicles. And in both those cases, the point is not to convince people to consume less energy, especially in developing economies. That's just not going to work. It's not even working in developed economies. Fossil fuel production just goes up and up and up. Same thing with combustion engines. The goal is not to convince people to drive less. We're not going to convince people to consume less energy. We're not going to convince people to drive less, however noble those endeavors are. The trend lines are just super clear. Energy consumption continues to go up. Driving continues to go up. Car sales continue to go up. But we can make the production and consumption of energy and transportation less harmful by using renewable energy and electric vehicles. That is what alternative proteins is. Convincing people to eat a whole foods plant-based diet is wonderful. It analogizes to convincing people to ride a bike and consume less energy. It's a really tough as a global strategy. So we really do need to go all in with making meat from plants and cultivating meat from cells, so that we can just go to consumers globally and say, this is the exact same product, but without the external costs. And hey, because it's so much more efficient, it costs less.
Right.
And that needs government support. The R&D is not easy. And scaling up these companies is not easy. And for the same reason governments are incentivizing renewable energy and electric vehicles, they need to be incentivizing alternative proteins.
I do want to talk about that government support and some of the work you're doing there, but you talked about the supply constraint on coconut oil on the plant-based side. On the cultivated meat side, I think in your report, it was $1.37 billion invested in the space, I think cumulatively by the end of 2021, I think that's the number. And you had a great graphic on kind of where we are in the evolution, and we're kind of entering the middle of the commercialization phase and trying to go from pilot plants up to kind of bigger scale. So when I look at how much production capacity we need to kind of really make a dent, it's a lot. I mean, I thought the Eat Just announcement where they're working with, is it ABEC, was a great announcement, 30 million or so pounds of meat per year out of that plant. I think that's the biggest announced number we've seen, but that's still just a small dent in the space. So talk a little bit about that. How are we going to get there in a decade to 2 decades to kind of really create the production capacity we need for cultivated meat?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to underline that it's plant-based meat and it's cultivated meat. So I would encourage people to call if you pull up that production volume modeling, the 2030 economic scoping document that we did. It's not just coconut oil. I pulled that up as I pulled that out.
Yeah.
But I mean, there is a lot of supply chain work that needs to be done there. Is a lot of manufacturing infrastructure that needs to be created. Even just to get to 6% by 2030. On the cultivated meat side, the challenge is similarly grand. One of the ingredients is albumin, which is a part of the growth media, and the costs for albumin right now are extremely high. The fundamental question of cultivated meat is how do you apply food-grade materials to something that has been medical heretofore? And then what does it look like to grow, cells essentially in 200,000 plus liter bioreactors? And there are there are a bunch of questions. There are more questions than there are answers. But a lot of enthusiasm from scientists as they dive in and answer these questions. And I think, fundamentally how the world needs to be thinking about this. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report maybe 6 weeks ago now. And in that report, they say what scientists have been saying now for more than a decade, and that is that it will be impossible to keep climate change below 2 degrees relative to increase relative to pre-industrial levels, let alone 1.5. The Paris goal is 1.5. The sort of backup goal is 2. Both of those are impossible unless meat consumption globally goes down. And literally nobody other than alternative proteins has an idea for how we make that happen. Right now, the FAO is saying meat production globally is going to go up by 70 to 100% through 2050. Most of that is in Asia. A lot of it is in China. A fair amount is in Central and South America. Meat consumption will go up a little bit in developed economies, but it's really going to be going up a lot in Central and South America and Asia. And what does it look like, to even cause that to plateau? We don't have solutions other than alternative proteins. And what that means is that the governments who have committed to the Paris Agreement really need to go all in on making meat from plants and cultivating meat from cells in the same way that they've done that with renewable energy and electrification of transport. And it's not a done deal. Like, we don't know for sure that it's possible. The more scientists dive in, the more optimistic they become. And just a couple of things to say as we analogize alternative proteins to renewable energy and electric vehicles. So with renewable energy and electric vehicles, we have all of we've got cobalt from the Congo. We've got nickel from Ukraine. We've got lithium from China. All of it manufactured in China. Like, these are processes that are difficult. And the world looks at these difficult processes and says, we can do that. None of those really huge difficulties apply for plant-based and cultivated meat. Similarly, renewable energy requires at least 10 times as much land per kilowatt hour, whereas plant-based and cultivated meat require a 20th of the land. So they have land savings rather than land requirements. So it's not absolute that these problems are solvable, but they look, to me at least, a lot more tractable than the problems we know we have to solve. We also have to solve this one. Direct emissions from animal agriculture are 20%. Land use right now is 3 billion hectares of land out of the 4 billion hectares globally that are used for agriculture. If we're going to double that by 2050, it's going to be 6 billion hectares. Good luck preserving the rainforest when you need twice as much land to create meat. With plant-based meat and cultivated meat, even chicken is a fourth the land. With beef, it's a 20th the land. These are really big solutions to problems that governments in the world know that we need to contend with. So governments really need to lean in and solve them.
So let's talk about that. You guys work with governments across the world. We've certainly seen certain countries make pretty bold national stances around, hey, we need to kind of reinvent our food system. It's a national security issue. Countries like Singapore and Israel, China has has come out with, I think, a 5-year or 10-year plan where I think they're definitely making alternative protein a part of that. So talk about some of the work you're doing there and what you're seeing happening.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I mean, this is our global battle cry. So, I mean, GFI is tiny. I mean, even by comparison to the really big environmental groups, we're tiny. Yeah. But by comparison to the resources that governments can bring to this, we're truly tiny. So our global battle cry in India, in Israel, in Brazil, in Asia Pacific, and in Europe is to meet with the right people in governments, the people who mostly we're focused on climate and biodiversity. To some degree, we're also focused on antibiotic resistance and naturally occurring pandemic risk, but really leaning into what appears to be, it's non-controversial scientifically that meat production needs to go down, and it's non-controversial that nobody has an idea other than this for how that happens. So really helping people to connect those dots. And it's been interesting. We are making significant headway every place that we operate. So even the Bolsonaro government in Brazil, I think in large part because JBS and BRF, their two largest meat companies and the number 1 and number 5 meat companies in the world, are leaning into alternative proteins. Even the Bolsonaro government in Brazil is sympathetic. The Netanyahu government and now the Bennett government in Israel is sort of basically alongside Singapore. Those are the two governments that are most in the lead. And the reason for that is that Singapore and Israel care a lot about food security. So they look at the 20 calories in to get 1 calorie back, 40 calories in to get 1 calorie back out from beef, or 9 calories in to get 1 calorie back out from chicken. And they think, gosh, we import most of our food. This would allow us to produce food in our countries. Singapore and Israel also have world-class scientific institutions, and they have governments that are enthusiastic about funding science. So Prime Minister Netanyahu was the first head of government to consume cultivated meat. He declared that Israel will be a leader on this. And they have created a truly robust ecosystem around plant-based and cultivated meat. Our managing director for Israel met with Netanyahu repeatedly. He has met with Naftali Bennett, the current prime minister, repeatedly. Really tight ties from our Singapore office with the government of Singapore, literally co-authoring papers with their Agency for Science, Technology, and Research, and creating ecosystems in both those places. As you rightly noted, China is leaning in. President Xi has talked about alternative proteins. Both the country's 5-year agricultural strategy and their 5-year bioeconomy strategy have been talking about plant-based cultivated and fermentation-derived proteins. And we're seeing that as well in India and Europe. So we picked the areas of the world where we operate GFIs, where we set up GFI affiliates on the basis of the governments that fund science and countries that have world-class scientific institutions, so that we can sort of light this fire and move to a world where billions of dollars are going into solving this problem. And that's going pretty well. And it really is bipartisan. So, I mean, so Bolsonaro is he's really a climate denier, but he doesn't want to give up Brazil's, second to the United States in terms of producing meat, and sort of farm-based economy. And the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office released a report last November. They said that by 2050, there will be 9.5 to 9.8 million jobs in alternative proteins and a gross value add to the economy of $1.1 trillion. So, I mean, that's what's driving Tyson and Cargill and Nestle and ADM. It's not climate or biodiversity loss mitigation. This is a lot more effective way of producing protein. And, you look at something like lithium ion battery production, which is absolutely essential. I mean, these are the batteries for electric cars. So Tesla is worth a fraction of its current value without the lithium-ion batteries that are produced in China. They have 95 gigafactories. The U.S. has 4. The U.S. produces about 1%, I think, of our solar panels. 70% of them are coming from China. 80% of them are coming from Asia. In the 90s, we were producing most of our solar panels. In the 90s, we were the global leaders on electric vehicles. And now China has more than 20 times as many lithium-ion battery gigafactories, and China is producing 60, 70 times as many of our solar panels as we're producing here. So the challenge for people who are interested in economic competitiveness, economic development, is the U.S. right now, we have the world's 2 leading plant-based meat companies. We are dominant in cultivated meat. But if other countries lean in on this, and we don't lean in on this, we could easily be left behind. Exactly what's happened with solar panels and lithium-ion batteries. And that's why people like Sonny Perdue and Scott Gottlieb, so Donald Trump's Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, Donald Trump's FDA Commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, both enthusiastic boosters of alternative proteins. So we think, I mean, it's been bipartisan so far. We hope it will stay that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just, hey, let's be good corporate citizens and good citizens of the world. There's like a real economic argument to be made. Hey, we if we're leaders here, and that's clearly been made and understood by the Tysons of the world. But what you're saying is politicians are starting to understand that on both sides of the aisle. And so you're having some good conversations.
Yeah, I mean, even in the UK, there was a report about economic opportunities coming out of Brexit, and the Johnson government and Conservatives in the Parliament in the UK are leaning into the idea of entrepreneurship and alternative proteins as something where the UK can lead and maybe even distinguish itself from the EU, because the EU has 29 governments, something like that. So it's going to be harder for the EU to make sort of decisions on a dime. Although the EU is also leaning into alternative proteins. GFI is co-sponsoring a competition with EIT Food, which is a European entrepreneurial, food-focused food technology contest, and we're sponsoring some science with them. So the EU's leaning in, but the National Food Strategy in the UK, they're recommending 125 million pounds for private sector incentives in alternative proteins, so something like $170 million, I think. And that's the Johnson government. So we're seeing, the Trump government, the Bolsonaro government, the Johnson government. It's bipartisan because it has to do with using capitalism, using markets. I mean, even if you're not that worried about the solve problems side of the equation, you're worried about, you're interested in those, 10 million jobs and $1.1 trillion gross value add. And the question is, do we want that in the United States, or do we want that in China?
There's 2 things I want to ask about the U.S. side of things from a political standpoint. One is, the Biden administration, I think, announced they're going to have their first food kind of summit. How involved are you in that? Or do you think there's an opportunity coming out of that? There could be kind of a catalyst there to push forward into future food alternatives?
The White House Food Summit is very focused on access and equity, a more equitable SNAP program, a more equitable system for farmers, making sure that farmers actually can't remember.
So it's less about new alternatives into the future. It's more about accessibility.
It's very local focused. And this is a critical point. Like, sometimes people will say alternative proteins aren't a silver bullet. Yeah. And we're like, yes, nobody said they're a silver bullet. Yeah. This is, we think, the most tractable way to cause meat production and consumption not to skyrocket. It doesn't solve all of the problems in food. It doesn't solve consolidation. It doesn't solve racism against black farmers. It doesn't solve food deserts. Although the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, like, one of the things they point out is that assuming alternative proteins are successful by 2050, on our current trajectory, food prices continue to go up. With alternative proteins being roughly half of meat production by 2050, which is the scenario that they run, food prices actually go down 10 to 12% instead of going up They don't say by how much, but probably 30 to 50%. And one thing just to sort of underline about alternative proteins, in addition to the fact that climate change most adversely impacts the people who did the least to contribute to it, and in addition to the fact that going from 3 billion hectares of land for animal agriculture to 6 billion hectares of land for animal agriculture is going to be awful for pastoral farmers, make regenerative ranching way harder. Like shifting away from those land needs, in addition to opening up massive opportunities for carbon sequestration, another thing that the IPCC says is absolutely necessary to meeting climate goals. If you go from 3 billion to 6 billion hectares of land for sequestration becomes that much harder. So this is not a silver bullet. It doesn't solve all of the problems. But it is particularly valuable for people in the global south. It is particularly valuable for the global poor who get hit when competition for grain drives up prices, as it does when you're growing grain to feed that grain to farm animals instead of making that grain available to human beings. That drives up prices and literally leads to starvation. The climate change that is caused by 70 to 100% more meat by 2050 is going to most adversely impact the global poor. We haven't even talked about antimicrobial resistance, but just to say, the UK government says that the threat to the human race from antimicrobial resistance is more certain than the threat from climate change. And we're currently feeding something like 70% of all of the antibiotics produced by the pharmaceutical industry are fed to farm animals. That is driving antimicrobial resistance, which is predicted to be killing 10 million people a year by 2050 at a cost to the global economy of $10 trillion. With plant-based and cultivated meat, that contributes zero to antimicrobial resistance. And then there's also a story to be told around pandemic risk. The UN Environment Program in July of 2020 released a report that listeners should look up. It's called Preventing the Next Pandemic. They pulled together something like 20 of the world's leading pandemic scientists, came to a consensus analysis of the most likely causes of the next pandemic. They listed 7 of them. The first one is increased meat production. And the second one is intensive animal agriculture. So 70 to 100% more meat by 2050 means 70 to 100% more potential vectors for the next zoonotic disease. And because we are creating these genetic clone animals, intensification of animal agriculture, genetic clone animals depresses their immune system. And then you cram 50,000 chickens or hundreds of thousands of laying hens into a shed, and you basically have created, a disease factory. And again, if you're making meat from plants or cultivating meat from cells, pandemic risk from your meat production goes to zero. COVID-19 was not a particularly transmissible or a particularly deadly pandemic, still sent more than 100 million people into extreme poverty. The next pandemic could be quite a bit worse. So it is critically important that we figure out how to do something about 70 to 100% more meat by 2050. Even if it's not a silver bullet, even if it doesn't solve all of the problems in food production, it tackles a pretty big one, and is important for governments to get behind, and the NGO community.
Final question. I was going through the comments submitted to the USDA around their call for commentary around the labeling, and I know that GFI submitted some comments. There's also a whole bunch of commentary from food and ag incumbents. And it definitely seems a theme I noticed is the cattlemen's associations of the world and the like definitely don't want cell culture meat to be called just meat when it reaches the store shelves. But what did GFI tell the USDA, and what are your thoughts on that?
We told the USDA a few things. Our fundamental observation is that current law around labeling already says that labels cannot be false or misleading. Labels that are especially prescriptive probably run afoul of the First Amendment, jurisprudence around commercial speech. And the companies are going to want to distinguish their products anyway. So there's not really a necessity for regulators to be too heavy-handed. But mostly it's a product that doesn't exist yet. So working with industry to figure out what makes the most sense from the vantage of consumers seems like it's probably going to be the best course of action. And it's definitely our impression that that is how FDA and USDA are already thinking about labeling. So we're pretty optimistic about that.
Any feel for where we are on the timeline to them approving this for sale in the U.S.?
Multiple companies have said that they expect to get approval this year. So it's being run on a sort of company by company basis at the moment. So companies are working with FDA and USDA on approval. And it's definitely our impression from talking to a lot of the companies that they're pretty close. So obviously it's only approved in Singapore at the moment. We would expect the United States before the end of the year. We would expect maybe another country or two before the end of the year. Companies are feeling really quite bullish on the future from a regulatory standpoint, which seems accurate.
You're doing lots of important things, so I don't want to keep you much longer. I always appreciate you coming on and having a conversation with you. I would encourage anyone, like I said, who's interested in the space to go to the GFI website. Anything in particular you're promoting right now? I know we talked about the reports.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to gfi.org/newsletters, I think we now have 5 newsletters people can sign up for. From the beginning of GFI, we have sent out monthly highlights, so people who want to track all of GFI's work all over the world can see what we think the highlights are. If you go to gfi.org/newsletters and sign up for our monthly highlights. We also have a bunch of job openings. So we have multiple openings in our science and technology department. We have multiple openings in our policy department, corporate engagement department, I think communications, a few others. So gfi.org/careers. And if you're listening from another area of the world, India, Israel, Brazil, Asia Pacific, or Europe, click on global. And you can go to the website of the relevant GFI affiliate and see what jobs they have open as well as what they're up to.
All right, Bruce. As always, thank you.
Thanks so much, Mike. It was a pleasure.
So that's it for today's show. Thank you to Bruce Friedrich of the Good Food Institute for coming on the show. As always, the Spoon Podcast is hosted and produced by me, Michael Wolf. The podcast is a part of the Spoon Media Network, and if you'd like to connect with us, just head over to the Spoon, you know where we are, or drop us a line at podcast@thespoon.tech. And if you haven't already given us a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify, please do so. It's really helpful for us. And finally, we are getting together in person in Seattle in November at the just announced Food Tech Leaders Forum. We'll be getting together with the people you listen to on the podcast leading the food tech revolution. So if you want to connect with a lot of these folks that are on the show, please come in November 3rd. You can find out more by heading over to the Spoon and going to our events page. All right, everyone, that's it for now. We'll talk to you next week.